Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing great today. Welcome to this third episode already of GemRubyShow in English. I am happy to say that today we are with Ben Sheldon. Hello Ben, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me here. How are you doing?
So I'm really good, thank you. Would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, where you're working at, and what you're working on currently, Ben?
Yeah, Ben Sheldon. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been a working software engineer for a little more than a decade now, though I've
Okay.
been an accidental techie for about 20 years. Used to work in sort of like nonprofit community media and community tech before sort of making the transition to like air quote software engineering. I currently work as an engineering manager at Github, but today I really wanted to talk about GoodJob, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
open source gem that I maintain.
Like you said, and maybe like a lot of you might know, Ben, you are the maintainer and creator of GoodJob, which is more than just a gem. It is a queue management service, but only based on Postgres and only for Rails, right?
Right. GoodJob is ActiveJob Backend.
Okay.
So it's sort of like Sidekick or Delayed Job or QUE. So that's right. It runs background jobs, but it only has dependencies on Postgres and it only works with Rails.
As I said, I am thrilled to talk with you today since we will talk about two of my favorite technologies, Rails and Postgres. And today I would like to talk a bit about the story of GoodJob. When you have developed this gym, what was the initial need to GoodJob?
Yeah, I'm like to give you the long story, though hopefully in short form. So I mentioned I've been doing software engineering for a decade.
Yeah.
I've been using Ruby on Rails for that long. And I think for pretty much that long as well, every project I've worked on, at a certain point, you sort of need a background job system where it's like,
Mhm.
oh, we can't just do everything we need to do in a web request. We need to sort of run something in the background, maybe for a little longer, or it needs to be a little more error resilient or something. So I sort of mentioned like Sidekick and Delayed Job and Queue. So those are all like different backends that run background jobs. And so I would say also for that decade of working with background job systems in Rails, they've been a little like difficult or frustrating to use.
Okay.
Like I feel like I've always used Delayed Job in my work projects, which
Mhm.
is Postgres backed, and I've used QUE in my personal projects, and I guess Q is also Postgres backed
Yeah.
as well. And I always felt like using both of them, they were a little difficult to use and sort of felt like they took a while to get set up. And especially with Q, it had this really cool feature where it could run in your web process, meaning that it it could execute background jobs sort of like out of the web request cycle, but still run background jobs, but you didn't have to like run a separate worker process.
Okay.
And so for personal projects where I'm running them on Heroku, trying to be like super cheap about it, it was nice just that you could like run jobs in your like Puma process. And
Okay.
then Q, they dropped that feature, and I felt like it was just like I was like, oh, I really love that feature. And I feel like there's always been this just like, man, what if this was easier? Also, like, had been working on projects where I was going really deep on Postgres, where we were doing a lot of stuff with advisory locks, and I was using Rails's action cable, their Postgres adapter, which I feel like is very rarely ever talked about. That there's a Postgres adapter for action cable that uses Postgres listen notify for sending those notifications for your webhooks. So I'd been using that,
Mhm.
and I spent a lot of time on one of my work projects configuring delayed job, where the work project, it was like the web front end was like 10% of the project, and actually orchestrating background jobs
Okay.
was the vast majority of it.
Okay.
So sort of like all of these kind of like factors came together where I was like, oh, I think I have the like technical knowledge to pull these various experiences together into the background job queuing system that I myself would want to use.
Okay.
And that was what sort of became GoodJob 0.0.1.
What you're saying is that there were already some solution, but a bit frustrating because they were difficult to set up and get things work quickly. And for your personal project and even for work, it was a burden sometime. But even if they work well, there were a lot of cool stuff, a lot of cool features that you love. You wanted to just dive in Postgres at some time, and you knew that, yeah, it was really cool to dive on this, and you decided to create your own queue management service to have something that you want to use and to have something that will be maybe less frustrating and less difficult to set up, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
I could
Yeah.
tell you a little more about that too. Like, I think one of the things that mentioned earlier is it's for Postgres and only Rails
Yeah.
that, you know, to be really generous, like to these other backend ActiveJob queue adapters, is, you know, all of them, with the exception really of GoodJob, predate ActiveJob.
Yeah.
Like ActiveJob was part of Rails 4.2, which came out in like 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, these other ones, they all existed and you could plug them into Rails before their Rails had developed this sort of like singular system called ActiveJob. I was able to sort of like sidestep a whole lot of complexity and stand on the shoulders of these giants, of these other queuing systems, because I was able to come along, you know, what was this, 7 years later, and
Yeah.
sort of like be like, I'm just only going to be compatible with ActiveJob. You're not going to be able to use GoodJob on Sinatra. And just sort of like lean on all of the stuff that ActiveJob already gave me for free, as well as, you know, all of the conventions that these other background job systems had already set up. Like, I didn't have to be particularly creative when developing
Mm-hmm.
GoodJob. It was more of sort of being like, oh, here are a couple of interesting pieces of technology that I think I can plug together in an interesting and valuable way. I'll
Okay.
just try doing that.
Okay, yeah. So ActiveJob was really something that helps you a lot to do something quickly and with a lot of ease that maybe the previous generation of queue management service was not able to have. Okay. It's really cool to have ActiveJob because it is the philosophy or phrase itself, you know. To go back to our question, I would ask you, after a while, there is a D-Day, you know, where you say, okay, this belongs to the community now. How did you know this was the time to open source it?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I think I like maybe how much time to spend on breaking down what it means to open source it. I
Mhm.
think for the lifespan of GoodJob, it has always been a public GitHub repository, like
Okay.
development in the open. That, you know, I think maybe the question is at what point, you know, when I published it to Ruby Gems,
Hmm.
that was the 0.1.0 release. And I'm like, I should look back, you know, this was 3.5 years ago. I'm like, how functional was it really? I think probably the reason that I did a gem release on it was because I was probably running it on 2 personal projects at that time. And so I was like, oh, I want to try to lock it in. And so I think, you know, doing development in public is just like sort of easy. You just do it kind of as a public repository and nobody knows about it. But I think it wasn't until like 1.0 when I actually like wrote a blog post and, tried to like share it and be like, hey, this is a thing that you should actually use. And, I think at that point, like it still, I was what's the benevolent dictator for life sort of role, where it's just like the strong product manager making every decision. And I don't want to say like, you release something. I think it mostly was crickets. A couple of people are like, oh, this is really cool. But like, if you build it, they won't necessarily come. I think the big shift was I had a pretty narrow product management perspective where I was like, I just want GoodJob to do like just ActiveJob and no more. If somebody wants a feature, they should build it into ActiveJob and then GoodJob will support it.
Okay.
And I had a little bit of a like epiphany, like people gave me pushback, which, after the fact, I really appreciated. But I had some conversations with some other developers it was RailsConf like 2020. It was like the remote one with folks. And they sort of were like, probably ActiveJob isn't going to accept new features until the backend adapters build that out. And I also read a blog post. It was like a historical retrospective from one of the creators of RSpec. And they sort of expressed remorse that they had held really tightly onto the project at first in a very sort of like way that I was. Like I felt like I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. And I sort of like, I think this is the point at which I was like, you know what? I think, if people want this feature, like, and I guess like I changed how I would sort of like evaluate feature requests. From I think initially my approach was just like, well, ActiveJob doesn't do it, I'm not going to build it, to a little more just like, tell me why you want this. Okay, I understand why that would be helpful. How difficult would that, like, does that make sense in the overall scope of like doing background job processing? Okay. Does it seem like something that I could support over a long time? Okay, yeah, sure, let's build it. And I think that was the point where, GoodJob, I think I went from a very narrow sort of like, it just runs background jobs for ActiveJob to a much more expansive sort of like, yeah, kind of like anything that doesn't quite fit into a web request, maybe it makes sense for GoodJob to do it. And that was where building out like scheduled jobs, building out batch jobs, kind of just like trying to add in more features that also seemed like they made sense.
Okay, I see. So you wanted to create something that was meant for the community at some point, and you just realized that you wanted to share more with people and to accept more feedback and accept more people's thoughts about what could be, if it makes sense, obviously, of what could be GoodJob. Okay, really cool. You didn't want to have any remorse, like you said, like a spec creator. Okay, I see. But it's really cool to have the feedback of the community and to let the project belong to the community and be able to do things with the community. It's really cool. But we all know that nothing is just a relaxed and a easy ride, right? And especially in open source, like we've said. And eventually, one day, you have you eat today a very difficult technical point, right? What is this tricky technical point, technical thing that might give you some headache?
Yeah, I have the hardest time trying to narrow this one down because there are so many, I feel like, difficult technical points.
Mm-hmm.
I think a difficult technical point that like comes up again and again though is sort of making design decisions thinking about like semantic versioning and upgrades. And
Okay.
like, so just to unpack that a little more, like GoodJob is a gem for Rails that is packaged as a Rails engine. So it's like this block of sort of like Rails functionality. And so the hard part of, like I mentioned, semantic versioning is that it's sort of like this convention that, like, if you upgrade from GoodJob 1.1 to 1.2, that should be a completely safe, non-breaking change. Like, you should just be able to update that in your gem file, bundle, install it, and like make no other changes. But if you upgrade from GoodJob 1.1 to GoodJob 2.0, or GoodJob 2.0 to GoodJob 3.0, that's going to have like a breaking change. And so you may need to make certain changes to your application if you're calling into GoodJob, or like certain things have changed with GoodJob that you need to make a change in your application in order to make that major version update. And I think when you're just talking about Ruby code, that is fairly easy to think about, like, how do I get from GoodJob 1.1 to 1.2? Because it's like there's all sorts of like helpful tools. Rails has a really nice library for writing deprecations and sort of like managing deprecations. So if I'm developing GoodJob and I'm like, oh, I want to like introduce this feature that is going to rename this public method, I can really, really easily like write a deprecation notice so that like if anybody is calling that method, they'll get a little warning that's like, hey, this method's going to go away in the next major release. Use this other method instead. So that like you have all these nice things about Ruby code, but GoodJob also has its own database tables and its own database schema for storing the job data in the database. And so the hard part is it's like I writing features for GoodJob so that those point releases 1.1 to 1.2, if there is a database schema change, that it still is non-breaking. I sort of have the convention that schema changes are not required until the next major GoodJob release. But that makes it really hard for me as the gem developer, that I have to do a lot of thinking about, okay, how do I insert this change that has a schema change in a way where like I will check if the database has applied that schema migration. If they haven't had it, then I have to like drop back to the old behavior. But if it has been applied, I have to I want to use the new behavior. And that's sort of like the term I use in my head is like crab walking, just because it's like, I feel like if you're writing your own application where like you control how you deploy it, you control how updates happen, you sort of like go in a straight direction where you're just like, okay, I'm going to build this feature. It's got a database migration. I'm going to run the database migration. I'm going to deploy. Like you just sort of roll forward. But like, as I'm developing this gem, I'm like saying it's crab walking. You sort of have to walk sideways because it's like, okay, I have a feature that has a schema change. I can't just force everybody, or I especially don't want to just force everybody where it's like, every time I make a schema change, I don't want to make that be a breaking change and force I would be on GoodJob version like 38 or something by now instead of 3. Like, because each one of those schema changes would be a breaking change. So I really have to sort of like walk sideways, in order to go forwards. I have to always be thinking like, is this going to break something? How do I make sure that it doesn't break something? And occasionally I'll get that wrong, and I have to go back and be like, okay, I have to redesign and change this so that the schema change isn't actually a breaking change.
Okay, yeah, it seems that upgrading the software and upgrading GoodJob and let people feel safe about upgrade their version. Yeah, feel safe about that is not something really easy. It seems that it is kind of hard actually. But as we all know, in all projects, you do not only have technical aspect. I wanted to ask you, what are the main non-technical obstacles in your journey with GoodJob today?
Yeah. I sort of mentioned, like, we talked about, like, sort of community feedback.
Yeah,
Um, I think a lot of it is trying to just manage my time, my motivation. Like, this is out in the community. People are using it. People are asking for me to make changes to it.
yeah,
And, meanwhile in my life, I, have a day job.
yeah,
I also have these other sort of like personal projects that I work on, that I get a lot of enjoyment out of. So I think trying to balance all of these inputs, and like I have a family, I have a life, like all of the stuff
yeah.
that's sort of outside, you know a very narrow view of work, or even a more expansive view of work. There's you know an entire life
Hmm.
going on. And so I think, thinking a lot about how I balance those things is I think the challenge that I experience. And I've been really, like, grateful with the response around GoodJob. It always kind of like comes as a shock to me when, it's like somebody mentions, like, on social media or something, where you're just like in a thread
Yeah.
and somebody's like, "Oh, have you tried GoodJob?" And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." Like, my heart kind of breaks because this is something that I helped put out into the world. But, I think in between those, how I get feedback, because I think I will say, just to give a view into my brain, I do like gamification. And the like, this is the first project, I'm like, "Oh, this is a serious project." But like, GitHub stars is something that, like, I never used GitHub stars at all. Like, I wasn't even aware of them, I feel like, until a few years
Okay.
ago. And then, like, with GoodJob, I was like, "Oh, people are starring this. This is feedback.
Yeah,
Like, this is nice." And I'm now almost like, I'm at, how many? Let me hover over this on GitHub. I'm at 1,946 stars on GitHub. So I'm like, "Oh,
that's cool.
that's really nice feedback." The other thing that, like, I keep an eye on, like, I don't want to say like these are numbers that, I'm not managing GoodJob to get more stars,
Hmm.
but it is really helpful to have quantitative feedback.
Yeah,
I'm like, "Oh, I'm on the right track." The other tool that I look at is, like, the Ruby toolbox. So they will, like, give your project a score. And then they also have, like, they will have a leaderboard. So I will admit, GoodJob is still pretty far down the background job leaderboard. We are, yep, still okay. We are just below Q on the
okay.
leaderboard. The score they give me is 0.79. Q is at 0.98, and the leader is Sidekick at 12.75. So, I don't know how much you can compare those scores, but, it is a fact that I'm like, GoodJob is nowhere near the top. But it has been motivating to sort of, like,
Okay.
have points of comparison, and get not just, the occasional person being like, "This is really nice," or somebody dropping into issues, giving
Yeah,
some praise and asking a question, but actually having some quantitative numbers that I'm like, this is a real thing out in the world that
I see.
people are using and has comparative value.
Yeah, it's really cool to have the community feedback, as we said, and it is something that is really important for a lot of gem maintainer. Actually, I have discussed with some of them, and each time we have this point that community feedback is important because it tells you, like you said, if you are on the good track. And also about the project itself, as you said, we had the opportunity to talk a bit before the podcast, and you said me that you wanted to have a project that fits your life and fits the way you see it. And yeah, you don't just get too cumbersome with a lot of technical aspect and just want to get things done. And it's really cool. So it brings us to our last question today already. What makes you proudest today with GoodJob?
Yeah, I think, like I mentioned, like I'm gonna give you a couple. I'm like I have a lot to be proud of, so I'm gonna not quite answer your question with just one thing. But I'm really I'm really proud of just like making that shift I mentioned from being a very constrained project, I think, to a very expansive
Okay.
one. Like admitting I was wrong in one sense, but I think just sort of like having a big head shift on that and going in a new direction
Okay.
that I was able to do that. And GoodJob, I think, as a whole was like able to do that because there definitely was a lot of design decisions I made early on in service of that very constrained view that I sort of threw out the window um,
Okay.
when it came to adding new features. I think that other piece is just being able to be responsive to people. Like I try, I guess, how much of everything is a response to something else. I think open source is really difficult for people. I think it's both difficult as a maintainer where you can get a fire hose of different people and different opinions and different needs.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it's really hard as like a contributor because I know, I hang out on Reddit and stuff, and I feel like a lot of the advice that you get some junior programmer is it's like, oh, go contribute to open source. That will
Yes.
build experience. And that's not very actionable. I don't know that I think it's difficult. It's difficult to find a project. It's difficult to know what to work on. And I feel
Mm.
like even if you get to the point where the stars have aligned, like here is a thing that you feel like that you can make a contribution to, there's a whole lot of like then questions where you're like, do I have to make an issue before I make a pull request? Can I just make the pull request? If I make the pull request, is anybody going to look at it? Like
Yeah.
if I make a pull request for a feature or a slight change, like am am I going to get actionable feedback or is it just going to languish? Like is I think of so many like pull requests where like you just aren't even sure if the maintainer wants the change you're making, and you
Yeah.
just like get all this feedback where it's like change this, rewrite this, like this needs to be rewritten in some other way, but you never get that feedback of your like if I make these changes, will that be enough? And so like these are all the traumas that I carry with me from being a contributor, that I'm like, man, I don't want to be replicating that as a maintainer of a project. And so, with GoodJob, I think it's trying to figure out how I can be accepting and give people meaningful, actionable feedback, and how to say like no directly, but in a sympathetic way.
Okay.
And
Yes.
for like people that jump through all the hoops in order to like actually open a pull request, and there's something wrong with it. Like I a lot of the time, like one of the things that I have discovered that GitHub allows you to do is that you can push commits into other people's branches if they open a pull request on your project. And so a lot of the time, like I will do the math in my head of like, how much time would it take for me to like give this feedback in a like review where I'm like annotating individual lines of code versus just like making the checking out the branch locally, making the change and pushing it back up, and then leaving a comment
Yeah.
being like, thanks, I made a tweet, this is perfect, merge, release, thank you so much. Like
Okay.
a
Yeah.
lot of that where I think of the mechanics of collaboration. And I think a lot of my thinking of my goal here is it's like the goal is to move forward. And so like what's the most helpful and expedient and sympathetic way in order to do that?
As a junior developer, I can say that it is not easy to contribute to open source. I did in the past, and it was cool, but always with someone to guide me, And yeah, it is something that you want to do. You want to help the community. You want to learn stuff also, but you need someone to help you sometimes, and thanks to do that. And for the part about the fact that you recognized you have recognized that you were wrong. Not everybody are able to do that, to be honest. So congrats, honestly, congrats for that. Thanks a lot to have been here, and thanks a lot to all of you to have listened to this episode today. It was a really great discussion with you. Thanks again, Ben. Where can we find you on the internet?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I feel like I've gotten this username in as many places as possible. So Ben Sheldon, I'm Ben Sheldon, BenSheldon, all one word, on Twitter, on Mastodon, Ruby Social, Ben Sheldon. Also want to just say the Ruby on Rails link Slack, give a shout out for them. I'm also on there. And if you ever mention GoodJob, I've got like a keyword notifier on there. So if you ever need help and you mention GoodJob, I will magically appear a lot of the time on the Ruby on Rails link really cool. Slack.
Thanks a lot, Ben. And also you can follow the podcast and follow me on the Twitter, on the X now. I don't know how I can say that, to be honest. Yet another dev. And thanks again, Ben. It was a really great discussion. See you soon, I hope. See you for next podcast or for another project. We never know. Thanks, Ben. Goodbye.